The Little House by the Lake, Episode 1, The Bell Across the Water. It was late in the afternoon when Daniel arrived at the little house by the lake. The sun was already beginning to disappear behind the trees, and the sky was turning a soft orange color. Daniel stopped his car in front of the house and turned off the engine. For a few seconds, he simply sat there. He looked through the windshield at his new home. It was small, very small. It had white walls, a dark wooden roof, and 2 windows in the front. There was a narrow porch with 2 old wooden chairs. Behind the house, he could see the lake. The water was calm, almost completely still. Daniel smiled. "This is it," he said quietly. He had been looking for a quiet place for a long time. His old apartment was in the middle of a busy city. Every morning, he woke up to traffic. Every afternoon, he heard people shouting outside his window. At night, there were cars, music, and sirens. He was tired of the noise. He wanted something different. He wanted peace. And now, he had found it. At least that was what he thought. Daniel opened the car door and stepped outside. The air was cool. He took a deep breath. He could smell the trees, the grass, and the fresh water from the lake. Somewhere nearby, a bird was singing. Daniel picked up one of his bags and walked toward the house. He opened the front door. The house was almost empty. There was a small kitchen, a living room, 1 bedroom, and a bathroom. The previous owner had left a few pieces of furniture, but most of the rooms were empty. Daniel didn't mind. He liked simple things. He put his bag on the floor and walked into the kitchen. There was an old wooden table near the window. Daniel looked outside. From the kitchen window, he could see the lake clearly. The water looked beautiful in the evening light. He imagined himself sitting at the table every morning with a cup of coffee, looking at the lake. For the first time in many months, he felt relaxed. He spent the next hour carrying boxes from his car into the house. Then he opened one of the boxes and took out a coffee maker. "First things first," he said with a smile. He made himself a cup of coffee. Then he walked outside and sat on the porch. The sun was almost gone. The lake had become darker. The trees moved gently in the wind. Daniel took a slow drink of coffee. "This is exactly what I needed." He closed his eyes. He listened to the sounds around him. The wind, the birds, the leaves, the water. Nothing else. No traffic, no people, no city noise, just nature. Daniel opened his eyes, and then he heard something. Ding! He looked toward the lake. He waited. Nothing. He took another drink of coffee. Then, ding! Daniel put down his cup. It sounded like a small bell. He looked across the water. There was nothing there. The lake was wide, but he could see almost to the other side. There were trees along the shore, a few small houses, and far in the distance, a small wooden dock. Daniel stood up. Ding! There it was again, a bell, but where was it coming from? He walked closer to the lake. The sound seemed to come from the other side. Daniel looked carefully. The evening light was fading quickly. He could barely see the small dock anymore. Then the bell stopped. Daniel stood there for another minute. Nothing. He shook his head. "Probably a boat," he said. Maybe someone was fishing. Maybe a small boat had a bell attached to it. It was not important. Daniel went back inside. That night, he slept very well. For the first time in a long time, he didn't hear traffic. He didn't hear people. He didn't hear music. He heard only the quiet sounds of nature. And he dreamed about the lake. The next morning, Daniel woke up early. Sunlight came through the bedroom window. He opened his eyes and smiled. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. Then he remembered. The little house, the lake, the quiet. He got out of bed and walked into the kitchen. He made coffee and opened the back door. The morning air was cold. A thin mist covered the lake. It looked almost magical. Daniel stood on the porch with his coffee. He watched the mist slowly move across the water. Then he noticed something. On the opposite side of the lake, near the small dock, there was a person, a man. He was standing beside a boat. Daniel could not see his face clearly. The man seemed to be an old fisherman. He was wearing a dark jacket and a hat. Daniel watched him for a moment. Then the man got into the boat and began to row across the lake. Daniel smiled. "So there is someone out here," he said. He finished his coffee and went inside. The rest of the morning was spent unpacking. Daniel put his clothes in the bedroom. He organized the kitchen. He cleaned the living room. Around noon, he decided to walk around the property. The house had a large backyard. At the end of the yard was a narrow path that led to the lake. Daniel followed the path. The grass was wet from the morning mist. When he reached the water, he noticed a small wooden sign. It said, "Private property, no boats." Daniel looked at the sign. Interesting. He had never seen the sign before. Perhaps the previous owner had put it there. Daniel continued walking along the shore. A few minutes later, he saw something in the water. It was an old wooden boat. It was tied to a small tree. Daniel walked closer. The boat was in poor condition. The paint was gone in many places. There were small cracks in the wood. Inside the boat was an old rope and a metal bucket. Daniel touched the side of the boat. It felt very old. He wondered how long it had been there. Then he noticed something strange. Hanging from the front of the boat was a small brass bell. Daniel stared at it. He reached out and touched the bell. It moved slightly. Ding! Daniel quickly pulled his hand away. He looked at the bell. "So that's what I heard." He laughed quietly. The mystery was solved. At least, he thought it was. Daniel walked back toward the house. On his way, he noticed an old man standing near the road. It was the fisherman from the morning. The man was holding a fishing pole. He looked at Daniel. "You're the new owner," the man said. Daniel stopped. "Yes, I moved in yesterday." The old man smiled. "I thought so." "My name is Daniel." The old man nodded. "I'm Samuel." They shook hands. "Nice to meet you, Samuel." "You too." Samuel looked toward the lake. Then he looked back at Daniel. "You heard the bell last night, didn't you?" Daniel was surprised. "How did you know?" Samuel smiled. "Everyone hears it." Daniel laughed. "Well, I found the boat. There's a bell on it." Samuel's smile disappeared. He looked serious now. "That isn't the boat." Daniel looked at him. "What do you mean?" Samuel pointed toward the lake. "The boat you're talking about has been there for more than 20 years. Daniel didn't understand. "Okay," Samuel continued. "But the bell you heard last night?" He stopped. Daniel waited. "What about it?" Samuel looked directly into Daniel's eyes. "That bell doesn't belong to that boat." Daniel felt a strange chill. "What?" Samuel nodded slowly. "I've lived here for 30 years. He looked across the lake. "And I've heard that bell many times." Daniel didn't know what to say. "Maybe there's another boat." "Maybe," Samuel said. "But there shouldn't be." There was a long silence. Finally, Daniel smiled. "I'm sure there's a simple explanation." Samuel smiled too. "Maybe there is." He put his fishing pole over his shoulder. "But if you hear the bell again tonight—" He paused. Don't go across the lake. Daniel laughed nervously. Why not? Samuel looked at him. Because nobody knows who rings it. Then he walked away. Daniel watched him disappear down the road. For several minutes, he stood there. He looked at the lake. The water was calm. Nothing seemed unusual. Old man's story, Daniel said to himself. He returned to the house. That evening, Daniel cooked dinner. He made chicken, rice, and vegetables. He ate at the kitchen table while looking out at the lake. The sun went down. The sky became dark. Daniel washed his dishes. Then he sat on the porch. He brought his book with him. For almost an hour, everything was peaceful. He read several pages. Then he heard something. Ding! Daniel stopped reading. He looked up. The lake was dark. He could see the moon reflected in the water. He waited. Ding! There it was again. The bell. Daniel closed his book. He stood up. He walked to the edge of the porch. He looked across the lake. Nothing. He waited. Ding! This time, the sound seemed closer. Daniel felt a little nervous. He remembered Samuel's words. Don't go across the lake. Daniel shook his head. He wasn't going anywhere. He simply wanted to understand where the sound was coming from. He walked down to the water. The old wooden boat was still there. Daniel could see the brass bell hanging from the front. But the strange thing was, the bell was not moving. There was no wind. The water was calm. The bell was completely still. Yet the sound came again, that ding. Daniel took a step backward. He looked around. Hello. No answer. He waited. Is someone there? Silence. Then, ding! Daniel looked toward the opposite shore, and this time he saw something. A small light. It was moving slowly through the trees. Daniel watched carefully. The light moved left, then right. Then it disappeared. A few seconds later, it appeared again. Daniel's heart began to beat faster. Someone was over there. He was certain of it. He went back to the house. He locked the back door. Then he locked the front door. He checked the windows. Finally, he returned to the kitchen. He looked at the lake through the window. The small light was gone. Daniel poured himself a glass of water. He tried to forget about it. He opened his book again, but he couldn't concentrate. His mind kept returning to the lake. Who was over there? Why was there a light? And why did the bell ring when nobody was touching it? At around 11 o'clock, Daniel decided to go to bed. He turned off the lights. He walked into his bedroom. He closed the curtains. Then he got into bed. For a few minutes, everything was quiet. Daniel closed his eyes. He tried to sleep. Then he heard it. Ding. His eyes opened. He stared at the ceiling. Ding. The bell again. Daniel sat up. He listened carefully. Ding. This time, the sound was different. It was louder, much louder. Daniel got out of bed. He walked to the window. He opened the curtain just a little. The lake was dark, but there was something on the water. A boat. Daniel could see a small boat moving slowly across the lake. There was no motor, no light. Someone was rowing, slowly, quietly, toward his house. Daniel watched. The boat came closer, closer, and closer. Then Daniel saw the person inside. It was a man. He was wearing a dark coat. He was sitting completely still. Daniel could not see his face. The boat stopped, right in front of Daniel's house. The man stood up. Daniel stepped away from the window. He could hear his own heartbeat. Then, ding, the bell rang. The man in the boat was holding something, a small brass bell. Daniel couldn't move. The man raised the bell and rang it. Ding. Then the man slowly turned his head toward the house. Daniel quickly moved away from the window. He stood in the darkness. He didn't know what to do. A few seconds passed. Then he heard a sound. Knock. Daniel froze. Knock. Someone was at the back door. Daniel didn't move. Knock. The sound came again. 3 slow knocks. Daniel's heart was beating hard. He walked slowly toward the kitchen. He stopped several feet from the door. "Who is it?" There was no answer. Daniel waited. "Who is it?" Nothing. Then a voice spoke. It was an old man's voice. "Daniel." Daniel recognized it. It was Samuel. He opened the door. Samuel stood outside. He was breathing heavily. His face looked worried. "Samuel?" Samuel looked past Daniel toward the lake. "Did you hear the bell?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." Samuel looked at him. "Did you see the boat?" Daniel nodded again. "Yes." Samuel closed his eyes for a moment. Then he whispered, "He's back." Daniel felt a chill. "Who?" Samuel didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the lake. "The last time that boat came to this house." He stopped. Daniel waited. "What happened?" Samuel looked at him. "A man disappeared." Daniel's face became serious. "Who disappeared?" Samuel looked back at the lake. "The man who owned this house before you." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. "What?" Samuel nodded. "He disappeared 20 years ago." "Did they ever find him?" "No." Samuel looked at the lake again. "But people still hear the bell." Daniel didn't know what to say. The 2 men stood silently in the doorway. Then, from somewhere across the lake, ding! Samuel looked at Daniel, and this time, there was no smile on his face. "Whatever you do," he said quietly, "don't answer the bell." Then the light from the boat disappeared, and the lake became completely dark. Daniel stood in the doorway. He looked at Samuel. Then he looked at the lake. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. For the first time since he had arrived at the little house, Daniel no longer felt peaceful. He felt that something was waiting for him. Something he did not understand. Something connected to the lake. And somewhere in the darkness, hidden beyond the trees, a small brass bell was waiting to ring again. Ding! Daniel closed the door, and he locked it. But he knew that locking the door would not stop whatever was coming, because the next morning, when Daniel walked outside, the old wooden boat was gone, and on the wet ground beside the lake, there were footprints. They began at the water, and they ended right outside his back door.